we don't expect someone to be reading a book and read one word or even one page and understand the meaning of the book. So why should we think that we're going to understand a work of art by looking at it for 5 seconds, 10 seconds? Hi, I'm Alexandra Kitka, and this is Ergo. Everyone seems to have an opinion about modern art. They hate it or they love it, they get it or they don't. But why the controversy? What makes modern art different from other kinds of art, and how should we react to it? On this episode of Ergo, we join you on location at the Museum of Modern Art with Associate Curator Thomas J. Lax to answer these questions and more. Hello, Thomas.
Hey there, Alex. How are you?
First, I want to talk about what it is you do as a curator, because I think that is a word that's kind of thrown around and people don't quite understand what it is you do.
So as a curator here, I do several things. I work directly with artists to commission them to make new work. I work with artists in their galleries, as well as artists and sometimes their estates if they've passed away, to bring works of art into the museum's collection. And then I also work to make exhibitions. So all of the art that our visitors see on the wall was put there by somebody, and I'm one of those somebodies. So together with my colleagues here at the museum, and there are over 50 other curators who work here at MoMA, we try to make ideas, concepts, and frameworks to give our visitors an understanding of what exactly it is that means something about the work that they see that's on view.
So, correct me if I'm wrong, but you work with the Department of Media and Performance Art.
That's exactly right.
So what is that department, and what makes it unique from other departments at the MoMA?
So the MoMA's been around for almost 90 years, and the way that the curatorial departments are organized is by medium. There was an idea in the emergence of modern art that art meant something because it was either a painting or a sculpture, and based off of the history of those media, it would mean different things to make a drawing from a photograph. A lot of contemporary artists work between different media, so today the distinctions between them are less meaningful than they used to be. But when this museum was founded almost 90 years ago, the difference between these various ways of working was incredibly important. And so when it started, it organized itself into these different departments. Our department, which is the Media and Performance Art Department, actually is the last department curatorially to be founded. It only has existed for just over 10 years, and that's because, first of all, the category of media, which is really kind of video and sound for the most part, wasn't invented until the 1960s, and similarly, even though there's a long history of performances happening, the idea of quote-unquote performance art also didn't emerge until the 1960s. So that's why, compared to our colleagues who are in the photography department or the drawings and prints department, we kind of arrived late to the game. So what that means for us is that in a lot of ways our department is inventing its own history, or it's trying to take the history that exists in different formats from different academic texts, artists' own histories of understanding these different ways of working, and trying within the context of an institution to tell a narrative that links all of these different traditions together.
I think it's fascinating that you talk about all the different departments and the different mediums that you can use in modern art, because I think there's a tendency to lump all of it together into just modern art. And in fact, at many art museums that are not specifically geared towards modern art, it is just one exhibition or one area of the museum. So I want to kind of dive right into this conversation and talk about what makes something modern art. I think that it's a popular misconception, and that people don't quite understand what makes something modern art.
So there's a very direct way to answer that question and a more conceptual way to answer that question. I'll start with the first one because it's a bit shorter. Modern art in its most elemental form is a way of describing art that's made at the end of the 19th century until just after World War II. So it's really a description of art made within a certain time period. And what happens after modern art is usually called contemporary art. So the fact that the Museum of Modern Art is called that in some ways is a bit of a misnomer, because it really should be the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art, since the work that we show here and the work that we collect here at MoMA goes up until the present. There's work that's in our collection that was made in 2017. But to go back to the kind of larger, more conceptual side of things, you have to ask yourself what happened at the end of the 19th century that caused the shifts that occurred that led to the rise of modernism, which is the category that encompasses modern art. You have, first of all, the emergence of industrialization. You have factories that across the 19th century are built in places like the United Kingdom as well as Germany, and effectively bring people to the cities in much bigger numbers than they used to be. Many of the people who come to cities are artists, and the work that they do inside those cities is fundamentally shifted by the fact that you have a new mass of people living in a way that they've never really lived before on that scale. In addition, you have new technologies that develop. You have film in the middle part of or in the end part of the 19th century, and photography in the middle part of the 19th century. And the fact that all of a sudden representation isn't something that only people who are specialized and trained within a kind of academic formation of learning how to paint are the ones who are depicting the world around them, but you have people who are self-taught, you have people who are taking images not for the purpose necessarily of making art, but for example, for the purpose of describing and documenting prisoners, which is how many of the first photographs were taken, means that the stakes of image making radically shift at that moment. And so I think because of these different historical factors that are happening at that time, the way in which artists are working similarly radically shifts. So you have the emergence of things like non-representational painting, right? You have the idea that instead of painting being something, at least in the Western tradition, that has to either be an allegory for a certain moment or a picture of somebody that people know, painting can now be something that's actually just about the experience of moving paint on the surface of a canvas. And so that leads to things like abstraction and the monochrome. And so I think that those, that conjunction or that intimacy between the social reality shifting and how artists are responding to that really gives birth to this thing that we call the modern.
Thank you for clearing that up and those particular terms. I think that because it's something that we kind of lump together, modern art and contemporary art, and also there is the fact that those shifts that happened during the modern art period continued into contemporary art. So I think for the purposes of this podcast, we are probably going to talk about both, since a lot of these characteristics carry on to this day. Is that okay with you?
Definitely.
So I want to talk about a popular thing that people say when they're talking about modern art, or when they're looking at modern art in any museum. They say, well, I could do this. And I know there are a lot of different responses, but I want to hear yours. So what would you say to someone who says, well, I could do this?
I guess the first way I might respond is a bit cheekily, which is, but you didn't do this. And I think what that it says is that it's one thing to make a work of art. It's another thing to have an idea for a work of art. And I think that is another really important thing that happens at the beginning of modernism, which is that all of a sudden, instead of the visual result of what an idea is being the most important thing, you have a shift to the idea for something being equally valued. And I think, if you wanted to pinpoint that someplace, many art historians would say that you could pinpoint that through the work of Marcel Duchamp, who was a French artist who moved to the United States during World War II and effectively invented this idea of the ready-made. He took objects that existed off of the assembly line and then represented them in the context of a gallery. His most famous, perhaps, work is his fountain, which is basically a urinal that he signed with a name that he gave to himself, R. Mutt, and then put on its side and then presented or tried to present here in New York City, but was rejected from presentation. But what's important about that work is that even though any of the three of us could make it, Duchamp was the one who had the idea to make it. And so all of a sudden, you have, instead of the fact of being, technically skilled or having a kind of dexterity to depict the world around you, that what becomes more important is to be able to take an idea and manifest it in real time and space. So I think that's the the longer way I would describe to somebody who says, this is something that I could have done myself. It's like, sure, you could have, but this person is the one who came up with the idea to do it, and not you.
Now, obviously, I'm not a curator myself, but I also think that when people say something like that, well, I can do that, a lot of times it's not actually true. I think maybe of something like the fountain, it could be. But a lot of modern and contemporary art actually involves a large amount of skill that we just don't necessarily see on the surface. One example I can think of is Mark Rothko and his works of abstract expressionism. And many times it's just color that you're looking at. And you think, well, any kindergarten kid can paint some different shades of colors on a board. When in fact, the amount of layering involved in what he did and the amount of skill that was required to actually make those works is something that most people just could not do.
No, I think you're pointing to something really important, Alex, which is that oftentimes in art, as in life, to make something look easy takes a lot of work.
Most people who are viewing art are not artists, and we really have to learn how to view art. Because if we go into an art experience thinking that this is something that anyone could do, well, first of all, we're going to be missing the point. And second of all, we're not going to be paying attention to those little things. And we're not going to be able to appreciate the art that we do see.
Looking at art is something that is a particular kind of looking in our culture. There's, we're all accustomed to walking around, and if we are seeing people, in other words, if we're not blind, to be able to take in the world around us. That's a slightly different experience than sitting in front of a television or going to the movies and taking in the images that appear for you there. But it then is yet another thing from going to a museum. And I think that working in a museum, you have to recognize that people come to the place where you are from very different kinds of backgrounds. Some people have a kind of comfort and familiarity with what it means to come to the museum and experience that as a kind of social space. Other people, that's their first time. And I think in making exhibitions, you really want to be able to organize shows that speak to people who have all different kinds of experiences, because ultimately the kinds of looking that are specialized for a museum in many ways are formed by the rest of the world around them. And so I think for even the kind of specialist audience who can come in and have the analysis of Rothko that you just made, which is a really beautiful one, you want to kind of ask them, okay, so what was Rothko himself looking at when he wasn't looking at other works of painting? And I think that opening up the space of the museum to that larger world and that larger viewpoint is in many ways what the role of historians and curators is.
So how much of the responsibility of understanding a piece of art goes to the viewer, and how much of that is dependent on the skill or the ability of the artist themselves?
It's a fundamental question. I think, Alex, you just kind of named one of the main questions at the end of the 20th century. There's this kind of common expression that art is whatever you want it to mean. And I think that while increasingly across the 20th century you have artists who believe more and more that the space of interpretation happens in the space of the viewer, that basically the viewer completes the artwork, I think that doesn't necessarily mean that the viewer can bring any and everything they want to the artwork. I think that while artistic intention is something that one will never know, what a curator can do and what a historian can do, and even what an artist does themselves through form, through composition, through the kinds of decisions they make, whether they're unconscious or conscious decisions, are the ways that you can look at and see what are the marks and the signposts for what there is to experience in the act of looking, or the act of feeling, or the act of hearing, depending on what kind of art it is. And where the viewer comes in, they, depending on what they just saw, who they're with, what other things that they've been thinking about in that moment, will be able to, in some ways, complete the sentence. But to complete the sentence means that, you have to look to see what the first half of that sentence really was, so that where you take it, in some ways, is a kind of dance or in conjunction with the artist themselves.
In other words, what you're proposing is kind of the midpoint between two extremes. It's not just whatever the viewer is coming with, and it's not just about the artist's intentions. It's more of a dialogue between the artist and the viewer.
That's a really great way to describe it. I think that the person who tries to facilitate that dialogue is the set of people who work at a museum. And that's what I love working at a museum, is that it's our role to take that conversation and try to make it as alive as possible. In many ways, that's oftentimes just about getting out of the way and trusting that the people who come to look at and hear artworks are people who, will bring their full sense of themselves and the knowledge that they know to the table, and that the way that you present the artist's work allows for the clearest viewing experience of the work that a person coming to see it might have. And so, it's our job to try to make that dialogue not unmediated, but mediated in a way that allows people to bring them their fullest selves, and for artists to appear in a way that's truest to the ways that they decided to make a set of decisions in constructing their artwork in their studio or elsewhere.
Something that I noticed that happens throughout art history, but I think maybe more so in modern and contemporary art, is that art is used very directly as a response to something happening in that society. You mentioned Duchamp before. That's a great example of that. And so I'm wondering, when we're talking about art, modern art, there's the message and then there's the form. Do you think that those two things are of equal importance? Do you think that the message may be a bit more important? What are your thoughts?
Again, you're asking one of the most fundamental and hotly debated questions that art historians have spent their entire careers battling over. I think that for myself, as an individual person, they're both deeply important. And that's a position. That's a position that's different from what this institution has stood for a long time. The Museum of Modern Art, which was a champion of a certain kind of modern art, abstract, formalist, believe that actually looking at exclusively questions of color, shape, line, and looking at those things over content, over the message, was what modernism was about. And I think that there have been many critiques of that to say that, what's actually appearing inside of the image is just as important, if not more so. And I think that one can have a dance in which you see them as being mutually informative, so that it's, the way in which an artist takes a set of things available in their world and then chooses to depict them inside of their work is a kind of give and take between how they're experiencing a given object that's in their surroundings or that they seek out, and then physically the way it is that they decide to make it. And I think that this challenge is one that's particularly important for artists of color, for women artists, because oftentimes there's been an easy dismissal of work by artists from those backgrounds because there's a way to read the work as only content, right? So to say, you look at it in a picture of, let's say, Barclay Hendricks, a fantastic painter from Philadelphia who made images of black figures that often were read when he made them as just that, images of black figures. But if you look at the formal ways that he approached that set of questions, the importance of the content of who's pictured in them becomes that much more dramatic and that much more complicated. And I think that, that in trying to tease out that set of conjoining factors is in many ways the kind of pleasure of making work and the pleasure of experiencing work in the space of a gallery or elsewhere.
When we study art from the past as opposed to the present, I think that there's this, it's easier to look back and look at both the form and the message and not emphasize one or the other. But I think when we're talking about art that was created now, 2017, there's kind of a danger in that we might just look at the message. I think of the culture we have of, you can call it like a meme culture, where we're very quick to share things and share posts because they are about something we agree with. And I think for that reason, we're not trained to look at art, not only for the message that it brings, but also for the content. Do you think that there is this danger in glorifying art for its message, even if the art isn't necessarily any good?
I wouldn't, Alex, say that there's necessarily a danger in that. I think in some ways the fact that art exists in more reproductions than it ever has before, that people oftentimes who are collectors will buy artworks before actually seeing it in real life, and that many of us experience the most cherished and prized works at a great distance as opposed to directly in front of us. While perhaps I don't think an ideal way to look at art is a good hook. And I think that that hook of content, let's call it, or of meme culture, as you so nicely put it, is one that we should see as just that. That should be the entry point. That can be a kind of gateway drug into thinking about a more deep and fuller engagement with an individual work of art. I think that the biggest challenge that you're pointing to is that it's much easier in a time in which something is made to understand something because of the content that you're confronted with, and to not necessarily see some of the structural things that are informing how artists are working. So even though, one can understand, to go back to your example of, let's say, meme culture, you can understand that an artist like, for example, Martine Sims, who's a young artist who just had a show here in our Emerging Artists series called Projects. She makes work in which the protagonists are often seen performing the same gesture over and over again. So it's as if you have a kind of GIF that's gone wild. And so I think there's a kind of simplistic reading that she's making that because of meme culture. But I think some of the deeper layers of how an artist is going about making their work, the fact that she's making work modularly, right? So it's work that can be seen on multiple platforms in different ways, on different kinds of screens for different kinds of audiences, is a function also of the culture that she's working in, of the internet. And some of those things can be masked by the fact that it is so recently made and we don't have the kind of the distance. And I think for me, what's great about approaching that is that's what the difference between showing work in the context, let's say, of the internet can be from the context of the time of a museum, is that you in some ways have a different temporality to kind of situate work within, which isn't to say that you can't do that on the internet, because plenty of good critics are able to do that there too. But in a museum, you can directly place a work by Martine Sims against a work by an artist who made, let's say, Howardina Pindell, who made her videos in the early 1980s, and you can say, oh wow, if you look at these two things, you can compare and contrast and see before you how different these two things are from one another, and that's the particular pleasure that a place like a museum can offer.
I hadn't thought about it that way, as it being a hook. But now that you say that, I think that you're really right, because at least when people are doing that, they're taking the time to look at it. They are giving it a chance to say, in other words. I think the other kind of perspective on that, if you take it in the other direction, are people who won't even think about a piece of art because when they look at it for the first time, it doesn't look skillful enough, right? Like we were talking about before, they may think, well, anyone could do this. And so then they don't even give it a chance. And I think that is much more dangerous than what I had mentioned before.
I think that I will completely agree with you on, Alex, because, and I'll tell you what I think the danger is there, is that oftentimes the work that reproduces well, the work that exists in the context of an iPad or on Instagram, is work that might be able to sell well and ultimately allow for the kind of economic values of, an object of art being a commodity to overvalue it compared to the set of ideas that go behind it. And I think, that's where you have things like this idea of zombie formalism, the idea that you can kind of take a recipe and a set of characteristics for what looks good, quote unquote, and apply that to making abstract paintings in a way that will reproduce well in the context of the internet, but ultimately the set of ideas that are being contested in the canvas or in the work of art are just not that interesting. And I think that in this moment where you have so much of a kind of valuation around art in the contemporary art market, where you have people investing in art as a form not only of a commodity, but also as something that can return your monetary investment in a work of art, means that those works that are really, that appear to be skillful or appear to just look good in the context of your, the palm of your hand, will skew the set of values that ultimately a public institution like a museum should stand for.
It's also kind of arrogant in a sense. When you look at an art for the first time and you, as someone who's not an artist, assumes they know whether it's good or not before coming to understand it, or even looking at it for more than 5 seconds. I talked before about art as a dialogue between the viewer and the artist. And that was something that was talked a lot about. Over the summer, I took a course called Theology and Art. And we went to see this play called Indecent. It's a Broadway show, actually. And for those who don't know what it is about, it follows the story of these people in Europe who are putting on a play in a very Jewish neighborhood, and the play involves a kiss between two women, and kind of about how that evolved and how it was received by different audiences. And when I saw the play with this class, something that really stuck out to me was how much theater, and I guess other forms of art too, they can't be one-sided. At the end, the director came up and he said, this audience made this performance. Every time it's different because the way that the audience receives things is always different, which is something that you don't necessarily get in more static art. But it's very true. When you're having a conversation, you can't be arrogant or that conversation's not going to go anywhere. You really have to submit yourself to listening to what the other person is saying and being willing to hear that out, even if it's something that you may not necessarily think is right at first.
I think that the format of your podcast lives up to that in a very nice way. And I think the point you're making is really true, is that, in many ways, what the experience of finding meaning in a work of art is also in many ways about being okay with not finding meaning there. In other words, many of the best artists and many of the best works of art are dealing with questions of uncertainty, of ambivalence, of fundamental doubt. These things that are have these negative connotations, but not even like negative in a kind of hyperbolic or in an extreme way. It's not like rage. It's, these things that are these subtle feelings. And how do you, as an artist, take those subtle feelings, which in many ways, as adults, structure our everyday lives, right? Like, whether it's a small decision or, kind of larger questions about who you want to be in the world and how you want to organize your values and priorities, they are muddled by the contradictions and the uncertainties that riddle every aspect of who we are. And so I think what the best art does is take those things, take that sense of vulnerability and openness, the way that you described it, and find a frame for it, whether it's in a story like a play, whether it's in an image, pictorial image of a painting, and through that experience of inviting you into the dialogue, as you so nicely put it, construct a frame for you to pinpoint some of the shared or even different ways of experiencing those kinds of gray feelings that are so important to who we are as people.
There's kind of a contradiction where people say that art, a work of art is worth 1,000 words, or an image is worth 1,000 words. But we don't expect someone to be reading a book and read one word or even one page and understand the meaning of the book. So why should we think that we're going to understand a work of art by looking at it for 5 seconds, 10 seconds? And so I think that, it's quite arrogant, as I said again, when people take so little time to look at something and kind of dismiss it like that.
Totally. Did you want to ask
No,
a question,
go
Alex?
ahead.
Well, I think one of the things that I love about working at a museum that has a permanent collection is that you actually don't only get the experience of looking at things for more than 5 seconds or 5 minutes. You also don't even just get the experience of going every single day to look at a work that's there in the, let's say installed in an installation for multiple months or even years on end, but you also get to track something over long periods of time, over a lifetime, over multiple lifetimes. And to me, that experience where you actually get to see an artwork change, I don't necessarily mean materially, although of course that also happens to all objects, is that, they shift in their physical chemical properties. But what I'm thinking about more is that, a work that was made 5 years ago means something different than it was in that moment. And I think you can see the way in which that dance that we were talking about earlier between form and content shifts a bit as the ways of looking at it around it have changed as well. And so, yeah, there's a real pleasure in being the custodian of something whose meaning you will never know because it will outlive you. And so I think it kind of also goes back to the kind of humility that you were describing before, is that artworks in some ways have their own lives, right? That we are in relationship to and are constructed by, and also attend to, but ultimately their duration, their livelihood, whether it's with work that is live art, performance art, or even just a painting, exists in this temporality that's far bigger, longer, more geological in its time frame than our lives.
So, with that said, with things that change in terms of the culture and in terms of society, and the fact that most of the time when we're looking at a piece of art, the culture that we're in now might be different from the one that it sprang out of. By what standards do you think that either a person like me or someone who's not an artist, and then someone who maybe is an expert, is able to critique that piece of art? Is it possible? Can you say that something that a piece of modern art is good or bad?
That's another really good question that in a place like MoMA, every curator would give you a different version of what good and bad looks like. I think, that's there's some people who've tried to replace those terms of good and bad with terms like more or less intense, which is a way of acknowledging that taste is totally subjective, right? What we see as good and bad, our judgments that we make, are completely informed by our own personal set of viewing and experiencing senses. And so the idea of something being universally good is a kind of fiction. But at the same time, I think that there is an importance for judgment. There's an importance for critique. And so what do you do when good and bad is not good enough? When even less or more intense is kind of too wishy-washy, to really put some stakes in the ground. And so I would say, something that for me a value that I will stand behind and subscribe to is, can you make a case for something? Can you make an argument for something? And even if that's an argument it can be an argument in words, right? You can make an essay, you can write an essay, you can explain why you believe in something, but it can also be something that you experience with your body, that you have a kind of physical, visceral reaction to, and that is something that you can name as, my left eye twitched in a way that made me know that I was looking at something that was both grotesque and also awesome, and that physical experience is itself information, is itself judgment that you can pull from to make a case for why something is worthwhile. And so I think that's maybe another alternative way to describe those categories of good and bad.
The Scottish philosopher David Hume wrote an essay that has become quite famous in the world of aesthetic philosophy, called of Standards of Taste. And in this, he talks about critiquing beauty and critiquing art more specifically. And although he does say that taste is subjective in the sense that we all come from different experiences, he does talk about this ideal that if we we're able to hypothetically remove these, experiences of our own selves and our distractions, then there would be some sort of form or some sort of type of beauty that would appeal universally. It would be uniform. And he uses this not to say that therefore your taste is either right or wrong, but he does it because in the sense, even though your experiences inform your art viewing, being aware of it is also something that's very helpful. Kind of funny example of this is the actor from Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them, and he's also in Les Mis, Eddie Redmayne. He actually has a degree in art history from, I don't know if it's Oxford or Cambridge, but one of the two. And he was on some sort of talk show talking about this. And I forgot the name of the artwork that he wrote his thesis on, but the work is basically just a shade of blue. They invented a new color, a new shade of blue. And he wrote
Is it Eve Klein, perhaps?
It could be. Yes, that sounds familiar. And he wrote his whole thesis on this. The funny thing is that he's red-blue colorblind. And so here's someone who can't even correctly see the color, which is pretty much the whole thing, who was able to somehow write this huge dissertation on its properties. And so I think that in a sense, being colorblind, you're aware of that. You know that there's something that is going to distract you from what it looks like. And if we come to art in a so-called humble way, and we're aware of our past experiences with art, we're aware of what we usually like and what we usually don't like, in a sense, we can come to a better understanding of that art piece and a more accurate way of critiquing art in general.
I think that the question that you're pointing to, Alex, is one that many people coming out of disability studies have made really important contributions to, which is that oftentimes the things that are presumed to be deficits or to be lax or to be even excessive are themselves vital, critical, key ways of knowing, and are themselves the places from which I wouldn't say universal experience can be named, but places from which vital and imminent critiques can be argued. And so what I mean by that is that, the idea of universal beauty or even universal truth in what trying to resolve historical wrongs could be are themselves short-sighted or are themselves projects that have a limited shelf life. And so that actually finding a way for multiple people to exist within multiple senses of experience is the kind of value and goal that much of what we do together can aspire to, and is actually already exists in the world around us. And I think in trying to inhabit and encourage that way of being, one can actually find the kinds of experiences that greatness aspires towards, that the kind of mess and smudge and smear and the generalized anarchy of feeling and looking or not looking and not being able to look is much of what the kind of greatest value in the experience of art can be.
Another example that comes to mind that goes hand in hand with what you're talking about is this Canadian fashion blogger, Molly Burke, who also happens to be blind. And she gets a lot of questions saying, well, you can't even see the colors, so how are you going to know whether something goes? And in her response, she talks about how when she picks out an outfit, she's actually doing something that a lot of people who are sighted will never be able to do, because she's paying attention to not only the colors but to the textures, and she's really seeing how things go together in a way that's not just on the surface. And I actually think, now that I say that this kind of goes back to the formation of modern art in the first place, because modern art really happened at a time when our history and our culture was suffocating in some way. there was total war, and there were all these things that were hindering our culture from being able to see something. And so what these artists did was that they took control of what they could control, and they took these new mediums. Duchamp took the materials that were available in a consumer time of history, and he created something that was a statement beyond just trying to make something quote-unquote beautiful.
I think Duchamp is a good person to come back to here because many of his works were themselves circular. He was interested in rotaries, he used bicycle wheels, he used these objects that themselves went around in a kind of ongoing and non-linear fashion, and ultimately history is something that, while we presume it to be something that moves progressively towards some ultimately better goal, is, at least as we've known it from Einstein's time, if not before, in other world cultures that believed in the cyclical nature of time, something that is more constructed through folds than it is through something that's a straight and never finishing point. And I think that in terms of what we've been talking about today, to think about the past that lives with us in the present through individual artworks is a way to describe the modern project as something that has yet to come to an end. I guess in some ways much like this conversation.
Good note to end on. So obviously we've just scratched the surface of these questions that we're asking. As you said, these are questions that are being asked by curators themselves and probably will be for dozens and hundreds of years. So do you think that there are any resources you can point to for people who want to learn more about modern art and its role in society?
The Museum of Modern Art is one place to start, and I'd be very happy if some of the folks who are listening out there came on free Fridays. The museum is open Fridays after 4 o'clock till 8 o'clock, and people can just come, wait online for a little bit, and be able to access all of the exhibitions and the performances that are happening here on a given Friday. There are also some amazing programs that are organized specifically for teenagers, and so those are all listed on the museum's website and are some of the best programs out there in the city, I think. And beyond that, I think starting with the world that's immediately around you. So, trying to figure out the questions that animate you and the ways to pursue those by looking at the things in more detail that surround you in your everyday lives is a kind of simple but universally available way to keep this conversation going.
Well, again, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me, Alex.
That's it for today's episode of Ergo. If you want more information about the Museum of Modern Art, you can go to MoMA.org. That's MOMA.org. And if you're a teen and you want to know more about that, you can follow the Instagram page. You can also donate to our GoFundMe page, which will be in the description of this podcast. Remember, we're at more platforms than ever before, and we also have all of our Season 1 on YouTube as well, so you can check that out if you've missed any episodes. If you want to know more about me, you can go to my website, alexandrakytka.com. That's ALEXANDRAKYTKA.com. Thank you.